One of the things I think we need to do is be clearer with our sources about why it is we want to tell their story, what they owe the public, what value that information has, what will happen if they don't talk to us, how we'll look at other places. You've got to constantly be working these people and saying, and not backing away from the reasons for the story and from the context. We don't sell our context well enough. You know what I mean by context? The purpose we're doing a story. Make sense? Okay. So these folks, you stand in with them, you push, you use leverage, you constantly remind them of your role and of their role. You get records if you can, you talk to other people if you can, you work around and around and around until you finally get to them. And you're not always going to, but you can't just ask and then go away. It just doesn't work. It really doesn't work. We're in this for the long haul. There's two other kinds of sources that I want to talk about. So these guys are at the high end, right? But don't just stop with them. Oh, here's the lead to this. The lead to the story I wrote was from earliest childhood. William Doran knew two things. He wanted to be a priest and he was gay. He was gay. It ended up being really interesting because I wrote this big profile of him. I did enough reporting to know that he realized he was gay before he went into the priesthood. He was in the seminary. He was wrestling with it. He had actually taken a leave of absence from the church for a year with their permission to explore his personal life because they said, we don't think... The church is actually interestingly compassionate about this internally, but externally it has these very rigid rules because a lot of people who are devout practicing Catholics are also anti-gay, so the church tries to walk this interesting political line. So he took a year's leave of absence, but his desire to be a priest was much, much stronger. So he came back, and he took his vows. He was not sexually active. I did enough reporting to know that. So even though he was gay, he wasn't like out having sex with people, right? He was faithful to his vows. The reason he ended up getting fired ultimately was not because he was gay, because the bishop knew he was gay. It was because he had written an article that publicly called out the church. So he was fired for disobedience. If he had never said anything publicly, he would have been fine. But the church can't tolerate or countenance disobedience, right? It just can't. It's like the army. You obey the chain of command. So he's fired. I do the story, but he's still a priest in good standing. He's fired for disobedience from that diocese by that bishop, but he's still a priest in good standing until my story ran. And when my story ran, he was then excommunicated and defrocked. You know what defrocked means? They stripped him of his priesthood. It's very rare. Happens very, very rarely. Usually, even with the sex abuse scandal that's sweeping the Catholic Church, a lot of priests who are being accused of sex abuse of young people. Almost all the priests who have been caught are still priests in good standing. They go off to some little priest retirement home somewhere, and the church pays them to live there and stay out of the public eye. They're not defrocked. This guy was defrocked. He was excommunicated. He fought his case all the way to the Vatican. He's the only American priest ever to have fought defrocking all the way to the Vatican, and he lost. So they kicked him out. He became a big deal for a while in the U.S. He's on all the national TV shows and everything. And he ended up then joining the Episcopal Church, which allows gays to be priests. And he tried to get ordained as an Episcopal priest. And at the last minute, they declined his ordination request because he was too public. He was now they didn't want him to be like this. They didn't want the attention and the controversy. He and I have remained good friends. We became good friends. I still see him. I just saw him. I saw him over Christmas. We had lunch together. He ended up working. His training was in psychology. He was a psychotherapist, a counselor. He ended up running a clinic for the most troubled kids in Minnesota, kids who they couldn't deal with any other way. They were like in the court system and the juvenile system, and so he ended up as a therapist to troubled teenagers. He met a guy, been together now for 5 years. They're going to get married this August. They got a wedding planned. He owned a restaurant for a while, and now he does foundation work for a nonprofit that works with senior citizens, old people. Really interesting guy. I very, very much wanted to stay in the church, but they got rid of him. I learned a lot. I learned a lot about how the church works. I learned a lot about the law and when the law applies and doesn't. I learned a lot about the hypocrisy of the church, about how it deals with people. Why do they defrock a guy like this, but they let people who are clearly guilty of sex abuse stay as priests in good standing? It was all very interesting stuff. And he introduces me to people when we're together, when we're like at restaurants or whatever, and people know him. He introduces to me as the woman who ruined his life. So there you go. Okay, you got public officials. Yep. Thank you. Which is why yeah.
It was like we don't speak about it. Why they print this?
That's why. Thank you, Tatiana. That's why I thought it was such an interesting story. Because I'm sitting around there thinking. I mean, this is why you got to think like constantly. You don't just go for the story in front of you. You're constantly saying, well, what's going on here? That whole notion of curiosity. And I'm going at one point, wait a minute. This guy gets fired for writing a story in the church newspaper that challenges how the church acts towards homosexuals. Who publishes the church newspaper? So I made a few phone calls, and I found out the bishop is the publisher. And the next logical thing, as you're going, is, then why did they let him write the story? Right? Who was watching? Who was paying attention? That's why it cracked open the door to say, here's how the church press works. Because if the bishop is the publisher and he let it go, he should have been the one fired, right? In the United States, if I wrote a story in my newspaper that, well, I'll give you a real example. Do you know the name Jason Blair? Do you know that name? Jason Blair was a young reporter for the New York Times, rising star, and he ended up getting accused of, and they found out that he was both plagiarizing and making stuff up. He was doing a lot of stories during the first, was it the first, not the first Gulf War. He was doing a lot of stories when we first invaded Iraq. Yeah, Desert Storm, thank you. And he was doing a lot of stories about, there was a famous case of a young woman soldier in the U.S. who was like caught in a battle there and came home, and she became kind of a celebrity. And he wrote a bunch of stories about her. Well, it turns out he was making them up. He was a cokehead who literally would just make shit up and put it in the New York Times. Oops! So somebody finally called him out, and they did a bunch of research, and they found out that, yes, this guy was really a bad actor. I mean, he literally was a coke addict. And he made a bunch of stuff up. Well, it wasn't just Jason Blair who got fired. The two top editors of the New York Times got fired because they let it happen. So the bishop technically should have been fired, right? Or the editor of the paper should have been fired. I think they let it go because the bishop knew it had been talked about openly within the church. The mistake this guy made was by then putting it out in public. And I think the people who were running the paper just thought, well, everybody knows this, and it's okay because he's keeping his vows. But that's what made it an interesting story. I had curiosity about it, so I asked, and then I turned it into a legitimate story about how the church press works. You got to constantly be looking for, well, what can I do here? How can I pull this thread? The bishop probably wasn't paying attention. So the bishop is the publisher, but Be interesting how many of your editors and publishers pay attention to everything that goes in your newspapers. They don't, right?
And they don't take the fall.
Yeah, they don't take the fall. The bishop probably just, wasn't paying much attention. And editor put it in because the editor probably said, well, we take columns from priests all the time. And then boom. And then somebody calls the bishop and says, what the hell? What's this about? And now the bishop looks bad publicly. I'll tell you a short little related case to this because it is about sourcing and access and then about this group of sources down here I want to get to. As I was doing this series of stories, one of them I told you I was doing was how the different churches deal with this issue, homosexuality within the church. And we had at the time a very, very, very famous, well-known archbishop. I don't know if you know the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, but the archbishops they're the big guys, right, who run several dioceses, and the bishops work for them, and then the priests are under them. The archbishop is the big dog, right? Short of going to the Vatican, the archbishop's the guy. And they have a lot of influence. And in Minnesota, the archbishop was probably the second most powerful person in the state, second only to the governor. And he had a really interesting reputation because he was very progressive about homeless issues. He had taken all kinds of stances on how the government should get more involved in social issues, big standing. And so I was doing a bunch of stories about the different churches, and one of the stories that we got onto, the religion reporter and myself, was about how the archbishop dealt with the issue of gays within the seminary and the priesthood, because at the time there was a study done of priests in the United States, 40% of them self-identified as gay. 40%. 40%. They say that the general population in the U.S., 10 to 15% of people identify themselves as gay. It's much higher within the church. And I got a hold of that study. It wasn't, it was an internal study done by the National Catholic Reporter, which is an independent newspaper that covers the church. And they had done an informal survey of seminarians, young men studying to be priests, and then people in the priesthood. And they said as many as 40%. And I got a hold of it, and I used that information, wrote about it. Of course, people were horrified. And then 10 years later, somebody came back and did another story in which, yes, this is true, and it kind of started opening the door to this whole controversy about the church. So one of the stories that we were doing was about that, and we found a priest in Minnesota that we went and interviewed, and we talked to him off the record. No, we didn't talk. We talked to him without identifying him, because he told us an interesting story. He said, well, the archbishop is actually quite supportive as long as you're honorable to your vows. And I said, well, how do you know that? He told me an interesting story about one day he gets called out to the archbishop's office at the last minute. It's a bit like called to the principal's office, right? Or called into your publisher's office. You're like, oh my God, what did I do wrong? So he shows up and he's convinced that the archbishop is going to say, you're out. So he's all nervous. And you know how we get when we're nervous? We blurt, right? We say too much. So the archbishop comes in. This priest is sitting there. He's sweating. And he starts, instantly the priest starts sort of apologizing and making excuses. And the archbishop stops him. And he says, no. That's not what I'm here to talk to you about. Which means the archbishop knows, right? And the archbishop says, the only thing I want to ask you about that is whether or not you're sure you're getting enough support, because I know this is a hard thing. I came here to talk to you about this program in the schools. So the priest tells me this story. We have it verified. We're not going to identify him. I call the archbishop's office because I want to comment. Because basically what the guy is saying is the archbishop is a good guy in our mind on this subject. As long as we do what we're supposed to, follow our vows, he's very supportive. He finds a way to support us. And it made sense because this archbishop was very, very progressive. He was a liberal social progressive. It made perfect sense. And he had a lot of political sway. So I call him, and I think, in my mind, he's one of these people, right? He's got big power. in Minnesota. So I have every right to push him. I called his office 38 times asking for interviews. 38 times. I mean, I kept a record. They wouldn't let me to him. And so finally I did the same thing with him as I did with the bishop who had fired the priest. I finally said to the guy who wouldn't let him talk to me, I said, here's the deal. I know that you think if he doesn't talk to me, I can't write this story. I'm writing this story, and I have a little career advice for you. You got to be willing to stand in there. I said, I have a little career advice for you. If the archbishop wakes up on Sunday morning and reads his paper and reads this story and didn't know it was coming and didn't have a chance to comment, I think the first person who's going to be in trouble is you. Now, he'll probably be a little bit irritated with me, but you know what? That's happened before. I'm okay because I don't work for him. So I think you ought to let him know. So guy calls back an hour later. He says he's not going to talk. And I said, well, we're going with the story, and I'm going to put in the story that the archbishop declined multiple requests for an interview, which makes him look even worse. Just want you to know. So I did that. Wrote the story. Didn't identify the priest. Very careful about that, but told the story. Talked to several other priests and theologians and people in the area who said, yes, the church has a way of dealing with this compassionately within, but it's difficult for them to talk about it externally because it's against church doctrine and it's all about obedience and all that kind of stuff, right? So we had the context. We had it nailed. I got a call that night from my editor, who is a devout Catholic and a friend of the archbishop's. And he called and he says, Jacqui, I just got off the phone with Archbishop Roach. And I said, really? The archbishop called you? Gee, I've been trying to get a hold of him for 2 weeks. And he goes, you show up at the office tomorrow morning and you be wearing your best damn suit. And I was like, whoa, what's going on? He says, we're going to see the archbishop. You never go see the archbishop. It's like being called to see the president, right? So I show up and 6 of us get trotted up to the archbishop's office for an audience. The top editor, that editor, the managing editor, my assigning editor, myself, and the religion reporter. We go up there. We go to the little anteroom, you know, the room outside the archbishop's office. The funniest part of this is my managing editor was Jewish. So funny, because we're sitting in this anteroom waiting, and the archbishop has us wait for 30 minutes, right? And it's all planned. He wants us to sweat. Right? He wants us to be nervous. So we're sitting there in this anteroom, and everybody's whispering. It's the funniest thing that happens when you go into a church, and we're not even in a church. People get really freaked out, and they start whispering. And we're looking around, and finally, the Jewish managing editor goes, why are we all whispering? And I was like, oh my God, that's right. And it's like all my Catholic childhood comes back to me, right? And I'm waiting to hear God from the clouds. And, you know, boom, 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 punish, punish, punish. So we finally get called into the archbishop's office, and we're sitting around this table, and he comes in. And he's a little guy, heavy drinker, red face, and he is furious. He's furious. And he basically demands a retraction. It's like, what are we going to retract? He says, you take this story back. Because he's now in trouble, right? Because they got somebody up in Washington, D.C. calling the Vatican who's calling him saying, what the hell are you doing out there in Minnesota? So he literally stands up, leans over, and starts pounding the table and screaming at me. The archbishop. He's screaming at me. He's a drinker. He wasn't drunk at the time. But later we did a story because he was driving home one night from somewhere and he was so drunk he ran his car into a 7-Eleven. A lot of people drink, right? I had a little too much to drink last night. So he's pounding the table and he's screaming at me about retracting this story. And now I'm getting mad. I gave this guy, if the archbishop would have sat down and talked to me, the story would have come out differently. Because he could have given me his side and explained why this was problematic from his point of view. I could have shaped the story in a way that maybe didn't make him look as bad. He may have talked me into not doing the story for all I know. You got to be open to these things, right? Didn't give me that chance. So he's screaming at me, and finally he looks at me and he says, you don't retract that story and a very, very good man's life is going to be ruined. And I looked at him and I said, well, that's very interesting, Reverend, Archbishop, Father, I can't remember what I called him. I don't know what you call an archbishop, come to think of it. I said, that's very interesting. Because first you called me in to tell me that I have to retract the story because it isn't true. And now you're telling me that a man's career in the church is going to be ruined, which means you know who that man is, which means you know that the story's true, don't you? Holy shit, he was mad. Oh my God. Editor grabs me, drags me out of the room, because, I mean, we're screaming at each other. It's that bad. The following Sunday, there was a letter issued from the Archbishop's office, read at the pulpit of every church in the Archdiocese, denouncing me and the newspaper. I didn't do the bad thing. Denouncing, basically saying that, we were bad, evil people, right? Here's the hard part of this story. I told you the story of Bill Dorn, who I had access to and cooperation from. He finally talked to me, right? This other priest who talked to me, but I didn't name, he ended up getting canned, run out of the Archdiocese. He had to go someplace else to be a priest. And he was furious. He was furious. Because I called him up. One thing you do with sources, you always call them back after the story. And you always face them again, especially if you've written something hard. You've got to normalize those relationships. You've got to face the people you've written about. So I called him back, and he just said, I wish you had never walked into my office. I never want to hear your name again. You've ruined my life. That's hard to take, but I don't think I did the wrong thing, because I think the people in that church had the right to know that. They had the right to know that. And everything I did was ethical. Kept my word. I was honest about what I was doing. I took care of it. 38 calls? 38 calls. That's a lot of calls. However, another level of sources. What time is it? Is it 11? Okay. Another level of sources are people I think of as vulnerable. So these people can take care of themselves, right? They got lawyers, they got power, they got public relations people, they got money. So we have to stand up with these people and push. Be ethical, you're respectful, you push. Vulnerable people are people on the opposite end of the spectrum. The woman in the clip I showed you, she's vulnerable, right? She's a private person, and she's a private person with very, very personal information that this reporter shared. Her kids are even more vulnerable, right? Because they're now in a piece, and they're identified, and they have absolutely no say in the matter. They have no way to protect themselves. In some ways, this priest I wrote about, not the first one, the second one, who we didn't identify, was vulnerable, because the consequences of him talking to me were huge and not entirely in his control. Children, we've got to take real great care with them, especially in the internet age. I am much more reluctant to name children in stories now than I was before the internet, because anybody can do an internet search, and if they know enough, they can find names and they can track people down. And there's just so much nasty stuff that goes on that way. Especially if a young person has done something questionable, because the internet has an indelible footprint. Once it's there, we talk about unpublishing in the U.S. now. People ask you to unpublish, take things down. The trouble is, once it's there, it's really there. The internet stuff doesn't go away. It lives in the cloud for forever. So let's say I write a story about a 15-year-old kid. Let's say I'm doing a story about teen pregnancy, and I do a story about a 14 or 15-year-old girl who's gotten pregnant. And it's a legitimate story. It's got social implications. And I find a kid, and she agrees to talk to me. The trouble is, 10 years later when she's trying to get a job, maybe she's pregnant and she's doing drugs. All kinds of bad stuff. Maybe she's a prostitute. Maybe she's a teen prostitute and is doing drugs and gets pregnant. 10 years later, she's looking for a job, and somebody Googles her name, and they find out that she was a drug addict when she was 15, and suddenly she can't get a job. So I'm much more careful about that now. People who are mentally ill, Down syndrome people. We write a lot about Special Olympics, things like that. They can't be responsible for talking to us because they don't know the consequences of talking to us. They don't have the ability to make what I call an informed consent. Do you use that term here do hospitals and doctors use the term informed consent? Yes, no, okay. Informed consent is a term they use in the US when you go in to get any kind of medical procedure, a surgery or whatever. You have to sign a paper that says you have been informed of the risks of this procedure and you have consented to it anyway. Right? Informed consent. I think of some aspects of dealing with sources as the journalist's version of informed consent. We tell people what the consequences of talking to us are, and if they consent, we do the story. The trouble is people who are vulnerable can't give you informed consent. A child cannot be responsible for talking to us, which means we have to take that responsibility on ourselves. People who are impaired by drugs or alcohol, when you're talking to them, you got to be really careful, right? Really careful. Because some people will say all kinds of stuff, and then the next morning they'll wake up and go, where was I last night, right? Now, if it's a public official who's talking to you when they're drunk, you not only write it, you write that they were drunk. That's kind of interesting news, right? What are they doing drunk out in public? I was invited, I'm not going to go because I'll be with you guys tomorrow night, but I was invited to a function at the U.S. Ambassador's place here. He's from Wisconsin. He went to my college. I've met him. He's a really cool guy. And I'd love to go. But if I were at the U.S. Ambassador's house as a journalist, even if I was invited there for a private party, and he said something really, really politically sensitive and acute and was drunk when he did it, you better believe I'd find a way to write about it. Because he's a public official, right? And if he says something about, relations between the U.S. and Ukraine or leaks some information about some trade deal, and he's drunk on his ass when he does it, I'd probably call him back the next day and say, Ambassador Teft, I just needed you to know that I've got this story I'm working on. Would you like to comment now that you're sober? I can't do that, though, with people who aren't in that position. And with anybody who can't really understand what it is we do, you've got to be really, really careful with them. So along with children, people who are mentally disabled, people who are in shock, let's say you're covering a traumatic event, big storm, earthquake, plane accident, and you're talking to victims, you got to make sure that they're not in so much shock that they don't know that you're talking to them. And I would also include, if you're doing work, let's say you're doing some economic stories about unemployment or poverty out in parts of Ukraine where you're talking to people who are rural, uneducated, or maybe they're immigrants who don't speak the language, right? We write about a lot of immigrants in the U.S. They don't know how the press works. And I think you have to be especially careful with them because even if they say they'll talk to you, they might not understand the consequences of talking to you. This has happened a lot in the U.S. where we talk to immigrants who are illegal, and we write about them, and then the INS comes and deports them, right? So then you've got to make those ethical decisions about, what's our job, what's our role. And then there's everybody in the middle. And I think these are the most interesting people we can possibly include in our stories, and that's what I call real people. These people are not real people. These are officials and celebrities. These people are in a role. Now, they have real lives, but for our purposes, usually we're not covering them as real, ordinary people. These people, you got to be really careful. These are the people who make your stories interesting. This is Jeff Connell, the postal carrier, the letter carrier who takes lost dogs home. He represents everybody in the post office. By writing the story of one, you tell the story of all, right? The universal story. These people are the ones from whom you need to get informed consent. So you need to be very, very clear with them about what you're doing, why you're using them. I think we don't explain ourselves well enough. You need to find their motivation. Why might they want to talk to you? You need to be honest about it. And they need to understand your process. And one of the things that happens when we interview people, especially since we spend so much time with these people, is we don't stop and explain our process as reporters. And we assume people know how we work, and they don't. They make judgments about how they think we work, and those judgments are usually negative and wrong. So explaining to people what you do, why you do it, how you do it. How do you take notes? Have you ever shown anybody a source, your notebook? It's a really interesting thing to do. When I was reporting, I'd have my notebook, and people are really interested, right? Because you're writing down everything they say. And they're like, right? So I go, oh, you want to see? Just want you to know this is how I take notes. No, I have this little system. I put stars here if I think it's a really interesting quote. I circle it if I don't think I've got it right, because that means I'm going to come back to it and ask you more about it, because I can't write as fast as you talk, but I don't want to interrupt you. Just keep going. Oh, by the way, is this really how you spell your name? Can you spell it for me? Show people your process. Let them know. I call people back. I have to get your contact information because I'm going to have to call you back, because I always forget something because I'm kind of lame. So before deadline, I'm going to have to reach you. Can I have all your information? Don't ever throw that stuff away. Keep it forever. Remember the priest I told you about 25 years ago? Getting busted, right? Fast forward 15 years. Not quite, maybe 12. And we're doing stories in Seattle. This guy's from Minnesota. Covered in Minnesota. I'm now in Seattle. And we're doing stories about the sex abuse scandal that's sweeping through the Catholic Church. And a religion reporter, I'm an editor by now, a religion reporter is writing about it. And one of the things we're trying to write about is how the church and whether the church disciplines people from within, because they kept saying we're taking care of the problem. And we're like, but how would we know? Right? Because it doesn't happen in public. So you have all these accusations against priests in the church, and the church says, we're dealing with it. And you find out years later, well, they dealt with it by taking one priest from one place and moving him to another place, right? That's dealing with it. So we had actually gotten wind, we had heard that the church had a black box that was essentially a file of priests that they had had to discipline. Now, the reason that black box was interesting was because it showed that the church did have knowledge, and it might reveal how the church disciplined these people. Is it really taking adequate action, at least according to the public, right? We couldn't get anybody to tell us, to confirm that there was a black box. So the religion reporter is running up against a brick wall. And she's a great beat reporter. She's been covering the church for a long time. She knows people, and nobody would confirm this. Church, obviously, I've said, it's like the Pentagon, right? Or it's like Microsoft. They don't want to tell you anything about their private business. So I finally said, this is a little lame. Remember yesterday I told you always keep those business cards, the Larry Oakes trick? Go through my old file of cards, and I said, I did this story on this priest a long time ago, and I haven't been in touch with him for a few years, but you could probably find him because you can track forward when people move and stuff. And I said he had this lawsuit or this court case that went all the way up to the Vatican, which means he kind of must know how things work inside the church. I don't know. Give it a try. She finds the priest, and sure enough, he tells her how to get confirmation of the black box. 12 years later, completely different state. So all of this information you gather is gold. And the more you can help people understand the context of it, the better off you are and they are. Making sense? Informed consent. And these are the people who bring your stories to life, which means put them on that list of sources when you're thinking about who could I go to reveal this story? Who could become the everyman stand-in for the public? And we're going to look at that more this afternoon when we look at leads. We're going to look at the power of leads that appropriately use an everyman stand-in to represent a bigger macro issue. It's especially true in economic stories because economic stories are so hard for people to understand and grasp. one of the best stories I saw a reporter do early on. It was during the dot-com bubble and crash in the U.S., and we were trying to get our arms around just the reality of this big run-up in dot-com companies and then the big crash. This really good beat reporter finds a couple who were in their late 50s, and the wife had quit work long ago because the husband had joined a dot-com company, an international company. He was making all kinds of money with this dot-com outfit, like $220,000 a year or something. I can't remember what he did, but he was working for a startup that was just, raking in the money. And so she quit, and she was something of a socialite. They bought a big house in the suburbs of Seattle. She had all this fancy furniture. They had 2 Mercedes parked out in the garage. She'd have, she loved to entertain, so she'd have dinner parties all the time. And then the dot-com crash came, and this guy's company folded, and he lost his job. And they thought they were sitting just fine, except 2 months go by, and 6 months, and 8 months, and a year, and he can't get work, which is the story of a lot of people that age in the economy. And we're writing those economic stories, but we find this couple, and we get them to talk to us. And this guy has now been out of work for 2.5 years. He's working as a greeter finally at Walmart, just so he has something to do, making, $10 an hour or something. His wife cannot deal with the fact that they no longer have the status. He insists they put the house up for sale. She doesn't want to lose it. Writing about those people helped us illustrate the reality of this rise, boom, and bust in a way that no other story that I saw up until then did. And the story was all about the economics of gambling on this particular sector of the economy. But because we found these people and we got them to agree, informed consent, to tell us about their personal lives, the story became much more real. Okay? All right. So I want to just give you a few tips on interviewing of these people. We talked about interviewing public officials and using leverage, being ethical and clear and following up, but using leverage and making sure that you just keep going after them and find ways to get that information, because that information really does, I believe, belong to the public. Whether it's a business, we're not talking about proprietary information that's going to bring a company down. We're talking about how a company does its work, whether its products are any good, whether they're defrauding the public, and certainly with government officials, their work does belong to the public, and our job is to go and get that information. You want to create partners out of both of these groups of people, but if you can find people's motivation to talk to you, you'd be surprised what they'll tell you. So what is some of the motivation? You've got to be sincere about this. This isn't a game, it's a negotiation, but you're not being dishonest. You've got to be authentic about it. Authenticity goes a long, long way. And if people believe you're sincere, they will trust you, and you've got to follow up on your word to keep that trust. People have enormous passion about their work and their lives. They have enormous pride. One of the best ways to get people to talk to you is to tap into that passion or pride. I talked yesterday when we were talking about editor-reporter relationships about your job as an editor, in part, is to be enthusiastic about stories, to actually care about them. Well, as a reporter, it's even more important when you're talking to people who you're interviewing. You've got to show them you're really interested, right? When I was a young government reporter, I had to cover the Planning and Zoning Commission. Do you have planning and zoning commissions here? They're the group of city government that basically figures out like where the streets are going to go and where the parks are going to be and where they're going to put a sewer plant and, whether a business can go next to a residential neighborhood. Boring, 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 boring. And I had to cover, because Planning and Zoning Commission determines literally how civic spaces work. And one of the stories I remember was my very first job as a reporter I had to work on was about the Planning and Zoning Commission was figuring out where to put curb cuts. Curbs are, that little, there's the street and then there's the rise and the sidewalk. And the curb, right? We call it a curb, which is that part that lifts up from the street. Well, you go around the corners in Kiev, and at the corners, the curb goes away, right? And it's just a little gradation down to the street. They take the curb out. It's called a curb cut. And they were having a discussion at the Planning and Zoning Commission about how much money to spend on curb cuts and where to put the curb cuts. Does anybody in here care? I didn't either. It's like, who cares about curb cuts? Well, let's think about that wheel we did yesterday. Who might care about curb cuts? Disabled people in wheelchairs? Bicyclists? Old people who aren't so stable? I've been watching in the neighborhood. There's an old woman who walks around, and she's got very, very swollen legs, and she's got 2 canes, and I watch her. She's walking all over the place, right? I've seen her 5 times now. Well, this woman cares about curb cuts because there's no way this woman can step off a curb. People with strollers, babies? Drivers. There you go. All of a sudden, but I'm too stupid. I'm thinking, so I go to my editor. I said, God, why do we have to write about curb cuts? You know what he said to me? He says, here's what you're going to do today. You're going to go find somebody with a wheelchair, and you're going to follow them around for a day, and then you come back and tell me you don't care about curb cuts. I was like, well, yeah, but what kind of person in a wheelchair is going to want to talk to me? Because that's kind of personal. He said, you don't think they care about this? Show them you care. So I found a person, walked around, and then finally I said, can I get in your chair and try this? So I rode around in a chair for a couple hours. It was great fun. I got really interested in curb cuts. And then I wrote about it in a way other people were interested in curb cuts because I made them think about sitting in that chair. People have passion for their lives. Tap that passion. Be curious about it. People love to teach. They love to be knowledgeable. Don't you love it when you know something and somebody asks you about it? It makes you feel good, right? You're like, hey, I'm not stupid. I'm kind of cool. I know a few things. If you can find people who have an expertise and use that as a way to say, boy, I really don't understand astrophysics. Can you help me out? If you're talking to business people, especially, who do something really arcane for a living, they tend to have real passion about it or pride in it, and they love explaining how their business works or how their field works, how they build things. That gets people to want to talk to you and tell you things that are much more interesting. The story that Christian told about the pole vaulter. What's his name? What? Bubka. That's an interesting name. If the reporter, instead of writing the odd piece he did, had sat down and asked the pole vaulter, Bubka, about his child, and hung in long enough to say, your child was just, in a major fall yesterday, badly hurt, and today you're here doing this work, starting your new business. How did you resolve where you belonged, here or with your child? You must really care about both. Tell me how you made that decision. Suddenly you've tapped this guy's passion for fatherhood, because I'm sure that was a hard thing to do. Maybe the guy's a jerk, I don't know. But I'm sure that was, and he probably cares a lot about this business he's starting to launch. Otherwise, why would he have gone at a time like this? You can go after that by thinking about it. If he's a pole vaulter who's suddenly starting a business in X, Y, and Z, don't you think he wants to get excited telling you how this business might work and why it's so important? Government officials respond to this too. They like being experts about what they're trying to do. Their purpose and motivation, they usually believe in what they're doing, or at least in part of it, right? So you want to be sincere about wanting to know that. I'm sure that when Steve Hartman showed up at this woman's doorstep and said, I'm here to do a story, and she says, there's nothing interesting about me. And he says, well, here's what I do. Once a week, I go and find somebody because I think everybody has a story. And she says, well, I don't. He says, well, let's just talk for a while. Then he finds out she has a hysterectomy. She's got these kids. And he's like, I'm kind of interested. And she says, well, it's kind of personal, right? Well, what if he says to her very sincerely, you know what? There are a lot of people in your shoes. And I think if you talked about what you're going through, they would understand it and it might help somebody else. A lot of people like to share really personal information if they actually believe it's going to help other people. When the two guys dying of AIDS talked to me for their story, it was because they really wanted the world to understand what it was like to be dying of AIDS and to be discriminated against. I knew that, and I didn't apologize for using that when I said to him, here's why I want to talk to you. Here's why I think this story is important. We talked about leverage. Authentic curiosity is huge. I don't know about Ukraine, but in the United States, we tend to overshare in the U.S. You know, the whole Oprah syndrome, everybody wants to tell all their private business. I don't get it, but it is interesting how much people crave being listened to, somebody who really listened to them, because we don't get much of that. I mean, our lives work really fast. And if you actually show up at somebody's doorstep, and I think this is what Steve Hartman is able to do, and just listen to somebody. I'm really interested in your life, really. It's really powerful. Again, you have to be ethical and honest. You don't want to pretend you're listening and then exploit the situation. But if you just really sit there and listen to people, they're just, wow, somebody cares about me. Empathy. Trying to relate to people. Trying to relate to people. A lot of power. Okay? Talked about negotiating terms. Okay. We're going to actually do a little exercise. When you talk to people, these folks often have a script ready, right? They say the same things over and over again. These people are not used to talking to the press, and so often they don't know what to say. And so one of the things that we need to get much more skillful at as reporters is the artful skill of interviewing. I literally think of it as turning story subjects into storytellers. How many of you have a group of friends, if you get together for dinner, there's one person at the table who's a natural storyteller, right? You'll be sitting there at dinner and most people are having a conversation about whatever, but there's that one person who's always like, they can't say anything without telling a story, right? So somebody brings up, somebody's complaining about salaries. Right? And everyone's like, yeah, it's really gotten bad. And then there's that one person who's like, yeah, let me tell you what happened last week. And they tell a story. Not everybody's wired that way. We got to help them be that way. And we move through interviews too quickly. We don't listen well enough. We don't follow up. We ask a question and we move on. We don't give people a chance to think through what they want to say and how they want to say it. And we often don't ask the kinds of questions that help them respond in ways that are honest and authentic, but turn our stories into better stories. Because we're not asking the kind of questions that help people give us concrete examples, say interesting things. Best example I can give you, we ask abstractions, we ask generic abstract questions. Sir, how did you become successful? I worked hard. Tell me the 5 smartest things you've done since you opened this business. And tell me the 3 things you wish you had back. Now all of a sudden I've got something concrete to go to, right? I get interviewed all the time by young journalists. They have to do profiles of somebody, right? They're learning how to interview people and do profiles. So they're sent around to profile somebody, a faculty member, and they come to me. And they always ask this question. Always. What was it like to win a Pulitzer? And I always say, great. And they're writing it down, and then they ask me the next question. How did you get into journalism? And then they go back and they realize they have nothing for their story because great isn't a very interesting quote, right? But what do I say? That's such a big question, right? We teach people not to ask closed questions, yes-no questions, right? Big questions are just as dangerous, especially if they're about emotion. You want to ask about actions, not about emotion. And if you want emotion, you want to ask about actions because actions reveal emotions. Steve Hartman didn't say to this woman, what was it like to know you weren't going to have children? Steve Hartman framed it around, what did you do? Well, she went out and adopted kids. That's much more interesting, right? So if you say to me, what's it like to win a Pulitzer, I can't say anything. But if you're smart enough to say, where were you when you heard? Oh, God, yeah, now I remember. My editor called me up and told me to meet her at the Blue Horse restaurant. It was really cold. It was like April, but it was really cold in Minnesota. I was wearing my gray suit. And I walked in to the Blue Horse. I'd never been to the Blue Horse. The Blue Horse is where all the politicians and big people hung out. And I was like, whoa, I got a little lost. And I showed up and I walked in. And she had told me that she was going to call me the night before and let me down easy because she didn't want me crying in the newsroom when I didn't win. And instead I walk in and she's sitting there in the corner with a giant, giant bottle of champagne and this smile that lit up the room. That's when I found out. That's a story, right? Who was the first person you called? I start talking about my editor back in Oregon who was just everything to me. Now I've got a story about what this person means to me. All these kinds. Asking the postal carrier, not how does it feel to have the post office under assault, or even what is your relationship with the public, but to say, do you know the people on your route? How do you know them? What do you know about them? Now that person can become a storyteller. Storyteller questions. Start at the beginning. Tell me about your day. Tell me about the day your business opened. What did you do? Who was there with you? Tell me about the day you decided to start this business. Sir, tell me about the day you had to lay off half of your workers. What did you do that day? How did you get ready for it? Who were you thinking about? Help them go back into the movie of their own lives. Who is it? Some famous person who says, maybe it's Shakespeare, all the life is a play and all the players are actors, right? Well, everybody's life is that way. We are invested in the movie of our own lives. And if you help people go back into the movie of their lives and explain it to you, you have much richer material for stories. Very powerful story. Give me an example. So you're talking to somebody about a business success. Well, give me an example of something you did that you think helped your business. Give me a for instance. Tell me about a time. Just inviting people. Tell me more. Tell me more. Tell me more. Active listening. Letting people know you're listening. Really? This is my favorite question. I have 3 versions of it. My favorite, literally, my interviewing skills are pretty basic. I'm talking to somebody and they'll say something, I go, really? Suddenly they know I'm interested. Or I'll go, really? Now I'm astonished. And I'll go, really? Now they know I don't really trust it, right? But what I'm doing is inviting them constantly to tell me more. And they're concrete questions. Keep shut up. I'm going to try something here. Ignore the red. Silence, silence, silence. That was 8 seconds. 8 seconds. Gets a little uncomfortable, right? You're interviewing somebody and you're rushed and you think you got to rush to the next question. So we fill in, right? Somebody stops answering a question. There's a little silence. We fill in. Don't. Keep shut up. if you let silence hang, especially if you get deft at using your notebook, even if you're a tape recorder user, and somebody's talking and you just keep taking notes because you're showing them you want to get it all down, and you just, they'll start talking. Not always, but usually they'll start talking. Let them fill in the silence, and they'll often tell you richer things. You ever had the experience where you're interviewing somebody or you're at a function, and as you're leaving, you got your coat on, you're starting to say goodbye, and then the interesting thing gets said, right? You can do that in an interview. Isabel Wilkerson, I told you about her. She's the one who wrote about the Mississippi River flood and spent 12 years on the book on the black migration. She has a whole process, an arc of interviews. And she talks about closing down an interview and then opening it back up. So when you're closing an interview on the phone, really smart, because a second interview is always more powerful because now you have a relationship. And even if you only can do one interview, you always make it two. And the way you make it two is either by calling back and using fact-checking. As Christian said yesterday, you use fact-checking to get more. Or you start to close down the interview. You know, thank you, Mr. So-and-so executive. I don't want to take much more of your time. This has been really great. Here's what I'm going to be doing. Oh, you know, while I'm going through this, before I hang up, I just noticed in my notebook I wanted to go back over this one last thing to make sure it's clear. You've just opened the interview back up. And now you have a completely different relationship with the person. I mean, it seems odd, but it works. So let silence work for you. Always do a second interview. Past extractions. Try to interview people in what I call their native habitat. You know, when they build zoos now, they try to build native habitat zoos because animals are more authentic in spaces that they actually live in instead of in a cage. Think of your interviews as putting someone in a cage and imagine how they would feel. Very, very off their pins and guarded and a little aggressive, right? But you put somebody in their native habitat and they're going to relax more, and you're going to have the ability to observe them in ways that allow you to ask better questions. Christian told you the story of the celebrity who responded to the email interview in exchange for 2 days of access, but the real stuff comes from following people around and watching them, especially in their place of work, if you're doing a story about business, or in their home. So as much as possible, you want to go where the story actually is. My father was a very shy man, and he did not like to talk. And if you asked him a direct question, he wouldn't say much. He didn't think he had much of an education. He was very smart, but he didn't have much of an education. He still spoke with a Polish accent. So he was a little, and so in young college, he sends all his kids to college, but when my friends would come home and talk to him, he was just really shy. If you got into a car with my father and he was driving, you couldn't shut him up. Or if you went out in his back shop with him where he was sanding wood, he'd talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. Because now he's in his comfort zone. Let people be in their comfort zone. Let them be doing what they do so you can ask about it, and they have something to focus on besides this grilling of a Q&A. It can feel really intimidating to people to be interviewed. They're afraid of us. Notice things around you. Ask about them. If you're interviewing somebody on the phone and you want some life, some scene, I used to do this all the time when I'd call the cops. We have to do cop checks at night. When you're a young reporter, you have to call like all the police jurisdictions in an area and ask if anything's going on, and they always say no. So instead of calling and saying, hi, I'm calling from the newspaper or anything to report tonight, I'd say, hey, Jacqui, down at the newspaper. I'm sitting in the newsroom here, and it's 11:30, and I have to call you. Where are you right now? Well, I'm in the police precinct. Really? What's it like there? You guys have donuts around? You got a window? I used to call the weather service when we were getting weather reports, and I'd always say to the guys, hey, I'm calling to get the weather update. Where are you, by the way? Well, I'm down at the Weather Bureau. I said, really? Yeah, but where's the Weather Bureau? Never been there. Well, blah, blah, blah. I said, you really have a window? No, we're down in the basement. I said, really? You work for the weather service and you don't have a window? So how do you know what it's like outside? It's fun, right? And I get a sense of where they are. I learn something. They're more engaged. I can put them in a scene if I have to. I actually teach my students now, if they have to do a phone interview, they often do it by Skype. And if the person on the other end is at Skype, let's say I'm doing, my students are doing a profile of someone. Let's say they're doing a profile of another journalist somewhere else in the country. I say, one of the things I'd like to know is where they write. Where journalists work is interesting. Where do they write? They're like, well, but I'm not going to go there. I said, well, you're going to be on Skype, right? Like, yeah. I said, okay. Ask them for a tour of their writing room. What do you mean? I said, well, have them take their their notebook, their computer around and show you their office. Have you ever asked a 4-year-old kid if you could see their bedroom? They love showing you their bedroom. People love showing you their spaces. It means something to them. That's a reporting technique you can use. Use props. This is really, really powerful. Props and artifacts. Artifacts are things that we hold on to that have meaning, right? Wedding ring is an artifact. A crucifix, that's important to you. It's an artifact. It's an object that has meaning in your life beyond the object itself. These are all around people. And if you ask them about those things, they can tell you stories in ways that they can't if you just ask them an abstract question. So if you see something, if you're in a CEO's office, I told you I met the U.S. ambassador a few years ago. And I was in his office, and he happens to be from Wisconsin, and he happens to have gone to my university. But I noticed in his office that the wall behind his desk has 3 rows of tribal hats from around the Stan countries, right? Kazakhstan and blah, blah, Stan and Stan and whatever. And there are all these tribal hats. I said, what's with the tribal hats? And he said, he's been stationed in a bunch of places around here. And when, I don't know if this was post-World War II, when they were busting up and dividing up the countries, or if it was post-Soviet and they went in and, the stands became the stands again as opposed to the Soviet Union. They found these things in a lot of offices, and he collects these hats. So very interesting, right? So I could say, well, where does that one come from? Oh, that's the time we're in blah, blah. Now I'm getting the guy to tell stories. One of the hats is a Wisconsin Green Bay Packer football cheese head, which is this styrofoam piece of cheddar cheese that people who are Packer fans wear back where I'm from. He's got a cheese head on his wall along with the hats. I ask about that, the guy's going to naturally tell me a story. And sure enough, he spent an hour and a half talking to me about going to Packer games when he was a kid. I know a lot about this ambassador now because I asked about his hats. Photographs, very powerful. How many of you have children? Okay. Do you carry a picture of your kid with you? Yeah? Do you? Yeah. And if you pulled out a picture of your kid, and I ask you how old the kid is, you'd tell me, and then I'd say, what's he like? And you'd start telling me a story because you have a photograph to look at. People keep things in their offices, and usually they have meaning. Even if they don't, it helps them to start talking about things. Especially if you're trying to get information that's emotional, people will tell you about something sooner than they'll answer that big kind of abstract question. Status details are things in people's lives that we presume mean something about their status in life. So often, the car somebody drives, right, can be a sign of status. The kind of clothes they wear. Not John Paul II, the Pope before this one, the one who just quit, Benedict. There was a lot of chatter about the fact that Benedict wore really expensive shoes, right? Contrast that with the new Pope, Francis, who wears very, very plain white robe, white frock. That's a status detail, and it tells you something about these men. It tells you what they value. With status details, you have to be careful because you don't want to infer what something means without really knowing it. So maybe somebody is wearing a really expensive pair of shoes that they got at the consignment shop for $10 as opposed to paying $800 for them. So if you're going to use a status deal to show people something about someone, you have to really know what it means. When I have students profile me, as an exercise, and I ask them, physical description, what would you use to describe me? They always mention my hair, right? And then they assume that my hair means something. They assume I wear my hair like this for some dramatic purpose, right? They assume I'm making a statement. And then I say to them, well, what if I told you I have a scalp condition and if I dyed my hair, like my skin would blow up? And then they get all upset, right? Well, I don't. I don't think. I don't know. I've never dyed my hair. But what if I just tell you I'm cheap and lazy? So if they're going to describe my hair and have it and use it to imply something, they better know that it's true, right? But those can be really powerful things to talk to people about. Why you wear a certain pair of earrings? Why do you drive a certain car? If they're relevant to the story. I'd love to know what kind of car Bill Gates drives. That'd be kind of interesting, right? So status details. Don't ask people how they feel. Don't even ask them what they think. Ask them what they do. Try to get people to reveal what they think or how they feel by telling you what they do. It makes for more interesting stories, and it tends to be more honest. I can tell you anything in the world about what I think, but my actions tell you a lot more. And again, it helps people become storytellers. Specific moments. What did you do the day that you were laid off from your job? What was the first thing you did? Where did you go? Who did you talk to? Framed questions. I think framed questions are really, really effective. Again, they help people answer your questions more specifically. What are the 3 things you're most proud of? What are the 3 things you wish you had over again? Had to do over again? What are the 3 things you worry about most? If you were going to leave a legacy, Sir, Mr. Government official who's doing blah, 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 if you can imagine what people are going to say about you when you die, what do you hope people will say at your eulogy? Oh, that's an interesting question, right? Makes me stop and think about how I want to be remembered. And if I ask that as a reporter, and he says, well, I hope people said that I was a good, faithful servant of the public, I'll say, then, and tell me the 3 things that you did as a good, faithful servant of the public that you're proudest of. Well, he's going to get past these blah, blah, blah distractions. And if he doesn't, I haven't lost anything but a little bit of time. So put questions in a frame. I have a friend who refers to interviewing as a full-body sport. And we tend to interview by asking Q&As. Man, there's so much more there. Studies show that less than 20% of the way people communicate in the world comes through the words they speak. Less than 20%, and yet that's what we rely on. The rest of the way we communicate comes in our body language, in our tone of voice, in our actions and unspoken things, which means as an interviewer, you want to be tuned into those things. It's a way of listening for a lie. If you're dealing with officials who don't want to give you the honest truth, you can kind of tell when they're starting to obfuscate, their tone of voice changes. Some people actually have, you know what, in gambling, do you know what a tell is? When people gamble, they have this thing they call a tell, and it's when people subconsciously signal what they've got in their hand, whether they're bluffing or not. Gamblers call it a tell because, you know, it's their way of telling you something without telling you something. Well, most people have a tell, right? Think about people in your personal life. If you have a partner or a spouse, you know when they're lying to you, right? You know when they're trying to avoid you. You know, they won't look in your eye, or their tone of voice changes a little bit. Well, if you start paying attention to all of the different senses you have, that becomes part of your arsenal for reporting. It opens you up more. Now, again, this isn't going to be true for every story. You know, if you're doing a story about, you know, some government policy, you're probably not going to deal with issues of smell. But you know what? If I'm doing that story about branding in rural grocery stores, one of the things I might want to pay attention to if I walk into that grocery store is what is that, you know, grocery stores have a certain smell, right? It's full of produce. Does the produce smell fresh? Is it, you know, bakeries? Somebody starting a bakery business, you're Mr. Buka Bukal, the pole vaulter, right? Well, if he's starting a bakery, and I'm going to write about his bakery, God, bakeries just smell great, right? And smell, just by the way, we don't use it very often in stories. Research shows that smell is the most powerful emotion connected to memory. So if I were to say to you, do you remember the smell of your grandmother's kitchen when you were a child? Or if your grandmother made a certain thing, it takes you right back to childhood, right? So don't ignore it. One of the tips I give to people who are covering emotional stories, we have to do a lot of coverage in the U.S. of families who lose a son or daughter in the war. And they go and they have to ask these, grieving parents horrible questions to try to understand what's going on. I always say, don't ask them how they feel about getting the news their son is dead. Ask the mother what her son smelled like when he was a baby. You instantly get emotion. She remembers. I don't know a single woman who's had a child who doesn't remember what their baby smells like. And this will just tune you into the world more. If you're doing a story about somebody who has a business that has anything to do with music, you want to know what things sound like, right? If you're doing a story about anything tactile, you want to know what it feels like. Touch things. Ask people about it. You're doing a profile on a master carpenter or something. Well, when he knows that the wood is perfect, what does it feel like in his hands? It helps people be more interesting and tell you more things. And finally, the sixth sense is your own emotion. You talked yesterday, somebody said, how do you know who to interview? And one of you said, you use your intuition. We divorce ourselves a little bit too much sometimes from our own humanity. And I'm not talking about going into the story and doing what the reporter Christian told you about, which is writing about yourself. But if you're talking to somebody and you feel outraged, or you feel emotional, or you feel sad, that becomes a signal to you to ask about that, because that's the honest human emotion, including, frankly, anger. If you're talking to a public official or a big dog person and you think they're lying to you, I don't think there's anything wrong with looking at that person and saying, sir, I got to tell you, I don't feel you're being honest with me, and I don't know how the public would feel that way either. What do you have to say for yourself? Let people know. You got to frame it right, but let people know. Use that to channel what you know is going to be an authentic reaction by the public, and ask people about it. Don't avoid that. Okay? Questions? Thoughts? Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of stuff to share, and it's a long experience. But how did you? What was the process of you developing these skills?
That's a really good question. God, I'm so old, I can't remember how I learned things. A lot of it was trial and error, was just going out and doing it and making mistakes. A lot of it was paying attention to other journalists I watched work and seeing the ones who were really effective and asking them, how do you get this person to talk to you? Especially when I was learning how to do investigative work and had to ask really hard questions of people. And I was nervous about it because even though I come across as kind of brash and confident, just like everybody else, I don't like conflict very much, and I want people to like me. You all love me, right? A little validation here, thank you. So when I was having to confront people, I would go to reporters who did that all the time, and I'd say, okay, walk me through how you lead up to the hard question. Because investigative reporters in the U.S. have an actual process, a very formal process they go through to prove their case and then try to catch the person in a lie. I read about it a lot. I actually pay attention to situations that involve questions and answers and listening that aren't journalistic. So here's a little share. I told you we share too much in the U.S. I went to a therapist for a long time. My partner and I were having troubles in our relationship, and I was kind of messed up about it, so we went to see a couples counselor, and I ended up going to this woman for several years to just talk about shit. It was great fun, once a week. I had somebody who just listened to me. That was their job. And I pay really close attention to how she got me to talk, because I told her stuff I didn't want to talk about, right? So I paid attention to it. I was like, how'd you do that? That was pretty interesting, right? I interview other people about interviewing. And I pay attention just a lot to what works. I also try, and I think this is a really important thing when you're doing interviews, you need to slow down and be completely present in the moment. We tend to be really distracted. We're all multitaskers. There are a whole bunch of you in here who are either on your computers or itching to be on your computers, right? Or your mind takes a little mental vacation, goes to Belize or wherever. And so I found, especially if you're working under fast deadlines, that the only way for me to be effective was in the moment when I was doing the interview to be completely and totally present and not be distracted by anything else. So I would force myself to slow down and pay attention to everything. Some of it I learned because I had to interview people who didn't speak English when I was in refugee situations and stuff, and I couldn't talk to people. So instead, I learned to use things around me and to communicate through objects and to read their responses and then write them down. I think most of it is about awareness. It's instead of just doing it by instinct or rote, you pay attention to what didn't work. The other thing I would offer in interviews is to be willing to... How do I want to say this so it's clear? Much more natural. I don't think interviewing is a natural act or a natural relationship. Some people will tell you an interview is a conversation. It's not. Because in a conversation, the goal is to share equally, right? It's to have an exchange and a comfortable, we're just having a conversation. We're having a dialogue. Your purpose in an interview is to get information. It's to get the stuff you need, which means there's automatically a power dynamic at work, and you have to recognize that and be honest about it, which means you have to bring on, to a certain extent, a persona. Not false one, but you're talking to somebody for a professional purpose. Now, it can feel conversational, but it's not a true conversation. Because your goal is different than it is in a true, authentic conversation where you're just sharing information or sharing interests. Your goal here is to come out with the information you need, which automatically puts the other person either at an advantage because they can withhold it, or a disadvantage because you've got the power and they're going to be exposed. But once you acknowledge that and you negotiate your terms and agreements and you figure out which level of person you're talking to and you're ethical about it, in the interview, if you can just be a lot more real. So if the interview isn't working, remember I told you the story about interviewing the woman who had gone, the dog sledder had gone to Antarctica, and I got to the point of the interview, it wasn't working, and I just literally said, this isn't working, is it? This is not working. You are not happy about this. I've changed the dynamic of the interview. If I'm getting to a point in an interview where I have to ask somebody something really hard, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, I'm going to ask you a really hard question right now and I need an answer. Boom. If you're going to ask somebody an emotional question, this might be really tough, and if it is, you need to take time or you don't want to talk about it, let's just take enough time to figure it out. If you stumble on a question, don't hesitate saying, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't do that very well, let me try it again. Just, it puts people more at ease, and it lets them know you're really trying. You're really trying. So, it takes years and years and years. It's not a skill that comes naturally. I think you've got to really practice it. I'm working on a project now in Missouri. I call it the Listening Project. I'm building a class on interviewing. We don't have one. Very few journalism schools in the United States teach interviewing as a class. They teach it as part of classes, but they don't really focus on it. My friends in Denmark actually have an interviewing curriculum. So I'm building an interviewing curriculum. I'm setting up a bunch of interviews with interviewers, going around the country interviewing people about how they interview. And then we're getting together this fall, if these people agree. We've invited 35 or 40 people from 12 different professions, all who have at the center of their profession listening for the purposes of their profession, and their profession has to have something to do with public service of some sort. So they're doctors, clergymen, educators, therapists, folks like that, politicians, cops, police, lawyers. We're having them come together, and we're going to spend 2.5 days talking to each other about how we learn to ask questions and listen, because those professions get trained to do it, and journalists don't. And that's going to be really interesting. So there are ways to learn this if you pay attention.